Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Meir Soloveichik, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to another Great Books conversation brought to you by the Zahava and Moshael Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought. Today we'll be discussing Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived, featuring speeches by Justice Antonin Scalia and co-edited by his son, Christopher J. Scalia. For me, this is personally a very exciting moment because hosting Justice Scalia at Yeshiva was one of the great moments of my life. I want to begin by thanking Moshael and Zahava Straus, our partners in the endeavor that is the Straus Center. And it's wonderful to have you both here with us. Thank you, Moshael and Zahava. I want to thank Jacob Weiss, who is here. And it's wonderful to be hosting this event at the Yeshiva University Museum. Jacob, the director of Yeshiva University's museum, is my colleague and has been a blessing in everything that we've worked together on, and has been a blessing as a friend as well. I want to thank the Straus Center's assistant director for operations, Arya Charka, who has been with the Straus Center for just a couple weeks and has been absolutely unbelievable in everything, in ensuring that not only that everything has been functioning smoothly at the Straus Center, but also that we have grown and taken extraordinary steps forward in great leaps and bounds. I want to recognize former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, who is here with us this evening. Attorney General Mukasey served our country with extraordinary distinction, and hosting him for one of these conversations at Yeshiva University and at the Straus Center was one of the great privileges of my life. And so it's wonderful to have him here as we honor the legacy of another towering individual in the legal profession. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you for coming, Attorney General Mukasey. When I was 16 years old, I was sitting and reading the newspaper in the library of Yeshiva University. And I noticed that an interesting Supreme Court case had been decided, which was called Gramet versus Kiryas Joel. And it sounded interesting to me, so I began reading the decision, and I discovered that the majority had ruled that a special school district that had been carved out for Satmar children in order to accommodate handicapped Satmar children was a violation of the Establishment Clause. I then turned the page and saw that a dissent had been written by one Justice Antonin Scalia. I was 16, knew very little about the law, but I began to read. And I found the following words. The court today finds that the powers that be up in Albany have conspired to effect an establishment of the Satmar Hasidim. I do not know who would be more surprised at this discovery, the founders of our nation, or Grand Rebbe Joel Teitelbaum, founder of the Satmar dynasty. The Grand Rebbe would be astounded to learn that after escaping brutal persecution and coming to America with the modest hope of religious toleration for their ascetic form of Judaism, the Satmar had become so powerful as to have become an establishment of the Empire State of New York. And the founding fathers would be astonished to find that the Establishment Clause, which they designed to, quote, ensure that no powerful sect or combination of sects could use political or government power to punish dissenters, has been employed to prohibit characteristically and admirably American accommodation of the religious practices of a tiny minority sect. He then concluded his dissent saying, I, however, am not surprised. Once this court has abandoned text and history as guides, nothing prevents it from calling religious toleration the establishment of religion. Ladies and gentlemen, I fell in love with Antonin Scalia on this day. And it was at that day that I committed myself to learning about jurisprudential philosophy, and I became an originalist. And the crushing dismay that I used to feel from that point onwards, when the originalists would lose a case at the court, which used to happen quite often, came with a consolation, because that usually meant another dissent from Justice Antonin Scalia. Then I discovered, and this was when the internet was in its infancy, a website dedicated to Scalia's decisions. This was known as, I kid you not, Cult of Scalia. Do you familiar with this?
I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah.
I emailed the webmaster at one point.
Yeah.
He got some fact wrong. I had to correct him.
This is, how old were you then at that time?
I was in college then.
Yeah, okay. So I was a huge fan. I'm thinking of your age, Chris, and I was a huge fan of Cult of Scalia, and it was the website that I used to read every day. And, it monitored both his decisions, but also his change in appearance as a cult. There was the exciting year or two when he had a beard, which was huge for us at Cult of Scalia, especially for the rabbis on Cult of Scalia. And then it was a fulfillment of one of my great dreams when the Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought, for one of its great conversations on a Religion and Democracy, hosted Justice Scalia in Lamport Auditorium, the historic auditorium of Yeshiva University, in what we like to say, and by we I mean the Straus Center, was the most historic event at the Lamport Auditorium since Rav Soloveitchik's Yartzeit Shiurim. And it was a glorious, glorious evening. And so it was with tremendous sadness for myself and for many others when we learned of the justice's passing. His intellectual and legal legacy, of course, lives on in his opinions. But his opinions only convey his mind, which was a great mind. But they cannot convey his heart, his soul, his faith, his humanity. As Justice Scalia would often say, that's not supposed to make its way into the law. And now, the eighth of Justice Scalia's 9 children. That's right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Oldest of 7, by the way. Yeah. Oldest is way better than being 8th of 9, just FYI. Yeah.
I'm not going to dispute that.
Yeah, okay. You will not dissent from that. Has done us an enormous service, co-editing with Edward Whelan this extraordinary book, Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and Life Well Lived. Chris Scalia is a former professor of English, works at a public relations firm near Washington, D.C., and his book reviews and political commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, and elsewhere. He lives in Virginia with his wife and 3 children so far.
No, 3 children, period.
Yeah.
If my wife heard you say that so far, she would have lost her mind.
It's not a contest, Chris. I mean, I have 6, but it's not a contest. Okay? And he has given us here Justice Scalia's speeches, yes, on law, but also on faith, on athletics, on hunting, on family, eulogies for his friends, and tributes from his friends. He has given us not only Scalia's mind, but also his heart and his soul. And we're here to use the book today to discuss Justice Scalia's legacy, but also his life, what he was like as a judge, but also what he was like as a young boy, as a student, as a father, as a husband, as a friend, as a Catholic, and as a human being. Please join me in welcoming Chris Scalia. So Chris, right before we jump off from the book itself, maybe you want to tell us just a little bit about, obviously losing your father was an unimaginable loss, and to begin to work pretty soon after that on this wonderful project. How did that come about?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank all of you for coming today. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here to talk about this collection. I worked on this book because my mommy told me to. Basically, she wanted, she and my older siblings knew that, we all knew that my father wanted to work on get a collection of speeches out. And my older sibling, a couple of my older siblings and my mom asked me and Ed to lead the way with it. And obviously I considered it a great honor and didn't think twice to accept it. I think you were saying some of the reasons these speeches are so important, why I was so eager to get this book out, because speeches, unlike legal opinions, there's an accessibility to speeches that legal opinions can't have. And my father did write very clear and accessible legal opinions, but even that kind of legal opinion needs to follow certain conventions and standards that are going to be off-putting to the average reader. So the legal speeches in particular convey his legal philosophies and jurisprudence very clearly, and I thought that was really important for the average American, not the law student or Supreme Court nerd or kind of person who reads cultofscalias.com, right, for example.
Those people are weirdos.
They are nutty. So that was really important. But Ed and I, Ed Whalen clerked for my father in the early 90s. We got to working on it really intensely in January, February of last year. It basically meant just getting all the speeches from his secretary. Some of them were in binders, some of them were just stapled in loose collections and boxes, and some of them were on floppy disks, which was...
What is that? Yeah.
It's an archaic form of data storage.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and so that it was kind of difficult. It was obviously fun reading them, but there was a lot of overlap and repetition, and it was
These
just kind
were largely unpublished, right? Ones that you really didn't know about some of them, or
only a couple of these had been published. Most of these I had never read before. A few of them were complete surprises, and some of the ones that that we expected or kind of assumed we would include in the collection when we first started ended up not making the cut, because there were ones that were more accessible, that made the same points or whatever more clearly and more effectively for the audience we were going for. So you had mentioned that he died really less than a year before we started this project. So it was emotional for that reason, but mostly it was, I think, just cathartic, because this speech, he was such a good speaker, and his voice comes through so clearly in the speeches. It was really like having him in the room with me again. It was pretty powerful.
I'll add, just people I've noted in reviews, that if you buy the Audible version of the book, Chris did the readings of the speeches, and everyone who knew the justice well says you did a remarkable job.
Thank you. Years of making fun of my father paid off by being able to imitate his voice. And Justice Ginsburg actually reads, she wrote the foreword for this, and she reads the foreword for the audiobook.
I would buy one with Justice Ginsburg reading your father's dissents against Justice Ginsburg.
That would be good.
That would be amazing.
That's volume 2.
That's volume 2. That would be amazing. So let's begin with your father's childhood, which he talks about in a wonderful speech in the book that was given to the University Club of Washington, D.C. in June of 1997. The title of this speech is a book about sports, a speech about sports. The title of the speech is Games and Sports, and he begins with an amazing sentence, which begins, "I have been asked many, many times, to what do I attribute my well-known athletic prowess?" And then he describes growing up in Queens, in the borough of Queens. As he puts it, in an era when college admissions were based on either academic ability, family background, or money. There was consequently no need for parents to ensure that their child was the striker on a traveling soccer team. He says the reason for that is because, for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost because there was no soccer. As he puts it, Americans overwhelmingly preferred baseball, a game in which a lot of players stand around while not much happens, to soccer, a game in which people run back and forth furiously while not much happens.
If I could just add, almost
please.
all of my siblings and I played soccer growing up.
Is that true?
Yeah. And I think maybe one of us ever played baseball.
Did he come to the soccer games or no?
He may have come to a couple. He came to other sporting events.
Yeah.
he often overstated how little he was involved in our sports, and he would kind of make fun of soccer moms and stuff like that. But he did actually come to some events. But we tried up to the end of his life to get him to like soccer, and it just never took.
That's he's right. He's absolutely right. I mean, this is like on The Simpsons when they had a commercial for soccer, and they said something like, "You know that, Francis? You know, so this soccer match will decide once and for all which is the greatest country in the world, Mexico or Portugal." Anyhow, so what is his childhood? He's growing up in Queens. Those of you who are from Brooklyn, I know who you are, will find in the book that he actually says that Brooklyn people played a much more wussified version of stickball than the boys, and something like that, than the boys in Queens. You can feel free to look that up, but what is his childhood? Who are his parents? How was he raised?
First he was born in Trenton, New Jersey. I can't remember how old he was when he moved to Queens, but he moved to the Elmhurst neighborhood in Queens. Yeah. His father was a professor of Romance languages at Brooklyn College, and his mother was a school teacher.
They're both Italian immigrants?
Well, actually, his mother was not. His mother had been here. His mother's parents had been immigrants.
But both Italian?
Both Italian, sorry. And, Catherine Pinero was her name, and Salvatore Eugene Scalia, his father was an immigrant from Sicily. He came over here when he was in his teens. So they were both teachers, and my grandfather had one sister, but my grandmother had 6 siblings, and a couple of them were school teachers. So between my dad's dad and my dad's mom and her side of the family, teaching was definitely in his blood right away.
Antonin is like a real Italian name, or it's like nobody pronounces it. Nobody knows how to pronounce it.
He discusses that. It's a weird name, and he says he's not even really sure how to pronounce it. So, he went by Nino for the most part. But, I'm drawing a blank here, but there is a story in this collection about the source of Antonin. I think it says
Antonino.
Antonino, yeah.
Was the original.
Antonino is a proper Italian name, but Antonin isn't.
I think he said somewhere, I remember in a speech, I don't remember if it's in a book, that maybe his father thought it was like more American if he made it Antonin, right. Which it obviously is not.
Right. Didn't work out.
Like, sometimes people ask me about Soloveichik, and I say it was actually Soloveichik Steen, just to shorten it.
But he had his parents worked hard and expected a lot of him, and he worked hard as a result, and went to Xavier High School in Manhattan.
So what is Xavier? Because he writes, this is an amazing thing. In a speech in the book, he says, quote, Xavier High School is the most formative institution in my life. Yeah. This is a man who went to Harvard Law School.
Right.
And he says that the high school that he went to was the most formative institution in his life. So what is Xavier?
He didn't say it was good. Yeah. He said it scarred him for life. No, he really liked Xavier. Xavier is a Jesuit school that was also a military academy. So he had basically an ROTC training and left Xavier with a ROTC scholarship. I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But he tells a story of how he would take the subway from Queens to Xavier with a rifle in the subway. It was in a case, but still he had a rifle with him because he was on the JV rifle team there.
So he's basically a high school kid taking a rifle on the subway every day.
What could go wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
And
this is where he picked up his love of shooting also?
It is, yes. Yeah. Though he was on the JV rifle team there, and he used to brag that the varsity rifle team at Xavier used to give the West Point plebes a run for their money in rifle contests. Yeah. But the hunting or the shooting love for shooting went into abeyance for a lot of his life. He didn't pick that back up until the mid-'90s or late '90s when I was out of the house.
We won't have time to cover it today. This is not the type of subject you usually cover in a Jewish audience, but he has a huge paean he has a speech to a turkey hunting association in the book.
That was one of the big surprises. I mean, when you think about it, though, what Supreme Court justice wouldn't speak to a wild turkey federation?
Exactly. So really, he loves you. He was so excited, clearly, to get this invitation. It was striking.
Good.
So he goes to Xavier. He has this naval ROTC fellowship, as you said, when he graduates, and he's hoping to go to Princeton. So what happens
Yeah,
then?
Princeton was his dream school, I imagine, because he had family in Trenton still. But he was rejected by Princeton, even though, of course, he graduated at the top of his class in Xavier.
Yeah.
Princeton turned him down, and he describes this in one of the speeches in this collection about that was one of the great disappointments of his life at the time. But looking back, he ended up going to Georgetown, which was, in retrospect, a much better fit for him. He really enjoyed his time at Georgetown.
Yeah, he makes
of course,
a comment
did well
in the
there.
book about sort of providence, that he believes that
Yeah.
providence, is that something he would stress to you guys, that you never know, like when a lifetime disappointment, when God is actually setting you up for
Yeah.
success or something?
In fact, one of the stories he tells in that speech we're discussing about another great disappointment he experienced was when he was not offered the job of Solicitor General in the early '80s. He had really been hoping for that. So it was a great professional disappointment. But if he had been Solicitor General, he wouldn't have been nominated to the Supreme Court. So overall, it ended up, as he says in the speech, turning out much better.
Yeah.
For him at least. I don't know about how other people think about that.
Yeah.
But and so he told that same story to my brother once, when my brother experienced a personal/professional disappointment. He told that same story.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then he goes on to Georgetown, and in one or two of the speeches in the collection, he notes that that's where he developed his dedication to writing well. So maybe speak a little bit about both how that formed him and what writing means. You are a writer, and what writing means to your father, and how he picked this up and what it means to him.
He had a professor at Georgetown named Professor Orr. He taught him freshman composition there. And Professor Orr assigned an essay every week. You had the weekend to write it, you turned it in, and he would get it back to you in time to improve on whatever you did wrong for the next weekend. And my father said that he kept getting these papers back with a lot of red ink and low grades. And I assume by low grades he meant B- or something like that. Nothing too embarrassing, but low by his standards. So he learned from Professor Orr just how difficult writing was, how much time he referred to the time and sweat necessary to write well in one of the speeches in this collection. And that's something that stuck with him. I asked him once whether, obviously I looked up to him as a writer and wanted to know how he wrote as he did, and I asked him whether writing was easy for him, and he said, no, it's hard as hell. And that was a huge relief, actually, because I didn't think it was very easy either. But of course, I should have known that answer because I had spent much of my life seeing him work hard in his study, writing, pounding out drafts, taking notes, and things like that. And actually, when I was a college professor and would complain to him about my students, especially my freshman composition students, he would tell me that story of Professor Orr, Dr. Orr, the freshman composition teacher he had, just to kind of, in that case, obviously not as an example of the hard work it takes to write, but as an example of the influence that a good professor could have, and trying to kind of keep me to maintain my high standards, because if I maintained those as a professor, my students would learn from them and hopefully carry on those lessons afterwards.
Yeah. It's interesting. So then he goes on from Georgetown to Harvard Law School. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, there are speeches to law school students in the book where he describes what you should be getting out of law school, and he talks a little bit about his law school experience. But it's all about the joy of technically studying law. There isn't a discussion about, this is where I developed my legal philosophy or something like that. Yeah. And I remember your father used to say in speeches a lot that people would come over to him and say, when did you first become an originalist? Describing the word originalist like it was a disease. I think the way he put it was as if they were asking, when did you start eating human flesh? Right. But I don't think there was this one moment, right? I mean, this is just who he was. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think he. I think it was. I think that approach to the law, he was kind of prepared for it, just given his Catholic education. I think there was something about that attention to the text and the history that he was kind of prepared for anyway, just given the education he had. So I don't think there was a single eureka moment. And he he also liked to point out that originalism is obviously not something he created or invented.
Right.
As he saw it, he was reintroducing something that all judges and lawyers had practiced up until really the 1960s in particular.
Just give a definition of originalism,
Sure.
just for those who don't read Cult of Scalia.
Okay. Originalism is an approach to the Constitution by which judges interpret it according to its original public meaning, and that is what it meant to the people who ratified it. And that's opposed to what's called the living Constitution approach, which says that basically the Constitution is a living document. It changes, its meaning changes with the times. So something that meant, as a clause that meant something 100 years ago means something different now, just depending on what the justices say it means. And closely related to originalism is something called textualism, which is basically originalism as applied to statutes and laws. So it's focused on the history and the text of a given statute or law. And my father's argument was that the problem with the living Constitution approach was that it seized power away from people and their legislators. It turned, basically, judges and justices shouldn't be the arbiters of a society's mores. That should be society itself, the people through their elected representatives.
Right. The great lie said against your father is that they spoke about him as if he never believed values can change.
Right.
Whereas the people would say Justice Scalia wants to take us back to 1789.
Right. Yeah, that's a really a frustrating caricature of what originalism is.
Right.
Yeah, it's not that we should be like we were in 1789. The point is that, or 1791 when it was all ratified.
Right.
But the point is that we are as we are now, and it's up to the legislators to really decide what we are. Yeah.
Right. It's for a democratic decision to make.
Exactly.
So the most significant thing that happened to him at Harvard Law School is not this eureka moment of becoming an originalist, but he was introduced to a woman by the name of Maureen McCarthy, which is your mother.
Good Jewish girl.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
It was on a blind date. A couple of friends of theirs set them up on a blind date, and it went well. And they didn't date very long. They were married less than a year later.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then 9 children.
Nine children.
Yeah.
That's 39 grandchildren right now.
Wow.
Yeah. So.
Wow. Fantastic. So this is the Jewish audience is very excited when they hear that. Now, one of the most, to me, sort of incredible speeches, which really talks about your mother, is a delightfully politically incorrect speech, if I can say that, which was given in 1988. I'm not even sure I could see any organization sort of inviting a Supreme Court justice to speak on this topic 30 years later. And the speech is called An Italian View of the Irish. He's Italian. Your mom is Irish. And he talks about what that's like. And he calls his children Irish children.
Well, he says he has 4.5 Irish children.
Right. Out of 9, right?
Yeah.
In other words, exactly. He did the math.
Yeah.
Which one of you is the half Irish one? That's the question. And it's clear. I mean, I call it politically incorrect. I mean, I think he kind of begins the speech to this Irish audience by saying that he's the designated driver or something like that.
There are some drinking jokes involved. Yeah.
That's Justice Scalia, not me. I'm offended by that. But by the way, this is a microaggression-free. This is a safe space. So you could say whatever you want. But it's very clear, that he. Tell me if I'm right. But it's clear that he sort of delights. Actually, he sees that actually the ethnic aspects of different groups is something to be delighted in and embrace as part of the tapestry of America. Mm-hmm. And we shouldn't sort of try to just be uncomfortable in embracing that. Is that true? And if that is true, so what is it like growing up with a Italian father, an Irish mother? Tell me about that marriage, that household.
Before I answer that, can I read a passage from the speech?
Please, by all means.
So this is, again, my father speaking to a group of Irish people. Now, the first thing you Irish should know about yourselves is that you're what are called ethnics. A lot of us didn't even realize this when we were growing up in New York. We thought we were just Greeks and Italians and Jews and Irish and all the wonderful diversity of Americans that made for good Pat O'Brien, William Bendix type war movies. But all the time, we were ethnics. Now, there is not a whole lot of use being an ethnic unless you're running for office or perhaps going through a confirmation hearing. But if you are one, I think you will agree that you ought to know it. So what we are talking about here is really that subspecies of Homo ethnicus known as Homo hibernicus. And then he goes on to the specifics of the Irish. The first appealing quality about the Irish, as seen by us subtle Italians, is their bluntness. There is very little beating about the bush with them. So some of these traits he's identifying in the Irish are actually obviously applicable to the Italians too. Like when he calls them calls the Italians subtle, that's obviously not the case. But my father,
it's the Jews who are subtle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
My father just kind of had a love for ethnic differences.
Yeah.
In a way, my co-editor Ed Whalen likes to point out that he appreciated differences in a way that a lot of the people who say we should celebrate diversity don't really love those differences at all. And my father really did like to celebrate them. That sometimes that meant poking fun at them, but all of it was kind of there was an underlying appreciation there.
If I can add one other wonderful example from the book, in the eulogy that he gives for a Jewish friend of his by the name of Maury Liebman, who I have no idea who that is, by the way, and I'd be interested to know. But he says, this is in the eulogy. He's, I guess, at the funeral. Jews don't have wakes, so this is, He says, Maury Liebman was Jewish. Indeed, with the possible exception of Abraham, God never created anybody more Jewish than Maury Liebman. That's literally what he says in this eulogy.
That's a good line.
Yeah. That stuck out to me. You're not getting that in most of the audiences. That's not what sticks out to most of the,
that's right. You're the first.
At the Federalist Society, for some reason, they did not focus on that.
The Catholic group I spoke to yesterday.
They did not
really
focus on that
either.
Exactly.
And as far as it was manifest, growing up, we were aware of the Italian side of the family and the Irish side of the family. And the jokes about both sides. My mother never gave a speech to an Italian organization making fun of them, but she did at the dinner table pretty often anyway. But also, was also clear was his affection, and I'm not just buttering you guys up because the books are free anyway. I'm not going to sell any books to you guys, but his love.
That
for,
was a microaggression against the Jewish.
That was right. Yeah. His love for Jewish people was also very clear to us. Yeah. And the stories he had growing up about them. Sometimes I think my father kind of grew up in a more diverse, he certainly grew up in a more diverse community than I did growing up when he grew up in Queens, and I grew up in Northern Virginia, the suburbs of D.C. So I was a little bit jealous of that. Though I'm glad I didn't grow up a Yankees fan, though.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have said that. Sorry.
No, it's
sorry.
fine.
That's a macro aggression.
Perfectly legitimate. Perfectly legitimate. We accept that. I'm wearing my Cubs cufflinks as we speak.
That I noticed. That's right. But also, I married a woman who was ethnically quite diverse, and I just kind of knew that wouldn't be too much of a problem with my parents because. She was Catholic, which helped, but I knew that they were open to that, and that was something they recognized the great qualities that different cultures brought.
Right. Your dad, I think, mentioned, I don't remember if he said this publicly or just to me, but there's a famous Supreme Court case involving Yeshiva University. It's about unionization in academia, and he said that when he was I think he was still on the Court of Appeals at the time. And he said there were Jewish judges on the court who didn't know how to pronounce the word yeshiva.
Yeah, that's right.
And they kept calling it yeshiva.
Yeah.
And he said, it's yeshiva. Don't you know it's yeshiva? He knew what it was. So that speaks to this. So as we said, he gets married. Together they have 9 children. Let's talk a little bit about your dad's approach to children and students by drawing on 2 of, I think, to me, as a father of children, very rich speeches that are in this book, and these are two graduation speeches. One was given at the graduation of your brother Paul, who is now a priest, Catholic priest, and one was at your graduation. Is that right?
Yeah.
You introduced your dad at that graduation?
I did.
Yeah.
We were talking about his name earlier, and I had the unfortunate experience of mispronouncing my father's name when I introduced him. It was
Not Scalia, just Antonin.
No,
Yeah.
because in my defense, I usually called him Dad,
Yeah.
and having to call him Antonin in front of my friends was apparently too much for me to take, and I stumbled on the name.
Yeah. So I would recommend these speeches to you. One of them, I mean, he also makes the point that basically he begins by saying in one of these speeches that he's done research, and that his research has found that since the founding of the University of Bologna, the first university, there have been exactly 6 million commencement addresses. And of those 6 million, approximately 5.5 million have been too long, 4 million have been too pompous, 2 million have been wrong. But he says those statistics are not as bad as they seem because, and for this I have the precise figure, of the 6 million, exactly 5,999,999 have been forgotten. And that his is going to be memorable, in other words. And he does give, I think, the best graduation speech I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And what he does basically is he goes through all the platitudes that are said usually at a graduation. And he shows why they're wrong. So, for example, he says, we live in unprecedented times. That's what people always say. And he says, it's actually not true at all. That actually the problems we face have been faced in history throughout, and when you learn history. But I want to just cite one passage and then jump off it because I thought this was absolutely remarkable. He said, the one platitude that you hear all the time can be variously delivered as, follow your star, or never compromise your principles, or, quoting Polonius and Hamlet, who people forget was supposed to be a silly man, to thine own self be true. And then he says, now this can be very good or very bad advice, depending on who you think you are. And he basically makes the point, they say in the following, he says, I am here to tell you that it is much less, he says, everybody says at a graduation speech you should be dedicated, to have a zeal, have a cause. And he says, I am here to tell you that it is much less important how committed you are than what you are committed to. If I have to choose, I will take the less dynamic, indeed even the lazy person who knows what's right, than the zealot in the cause of error. Yeah. I found that unbelievably striking. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to say. That was awesome. Does your father, as parents, sort of dispensing advice like this, or is he modeling it, or he's just...
Mostly it was modeling. My parents rarely sat us down for Brady Bunch style lectures.
Right.
Mostly we kind of just knew what they expected.
They only had 6 kids in the Brady Bunch, so that wouldn't work.
That's a good point. Yeah. Slackers.
Yeah, exactly.
And they weren't even. I mean, they cheated. They combined the families
I was
too,
going to say that too, but it seemed rude.
But he did occasionally just kind of, make clear explicitly by telling us about the importance of conscience formation, and often would be in the context of the church, but not always. But I love that speech too, because my father was a rigorous thinker, obviously, and he loved challenging preconceived notions, and that's right. What graduation platitudes are all about. And so he loved getting behind those meanings and really analyzing them closely. And that was, more than anything, that's what I saw him do kind of pretty much every day, not just in his opinions, but in conversation. And I think that made conversation with him challenging at times, but always fun and engaging.
So let's talk a little bit about Christianity, Catholicism, the role that played in your home and in your life. There's a whole section devoted to faith in this book, speeches about faith. And there was one that spoke to me, and I think to many people in this audience. My great-uncle, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, has a famous talk where he describes the role of the person of faith in the world as being as how Abraham described himself. He said, I am a stranger and a neighbor among you, which means that you're simultaneously a neighbor, you're part of society, but your faith sets you apart. And he has a very similar speech. Yeah. Called Christianity and Difference, something like that. And here's how he puts it. He says the differentness. He says to be a Catholic is to be different. I think it's a speech to Catholics.
Yeah.
The differentness said to me in the field of religion what my parents repeatedly reminded me of in the field of social activity. Whenever I wanted to go to a certain movie or a certain place that my parents disapproved of, I would say, of course, as children always do, that everyone else was going. My parents' invariable and unanswerable response was, "You're not everybody else." It is enormously important, I think, for Christians to learn early and remember long that lesson of difference, to recognize that what is perfectly lawful and perfectly permissible for everyone else is not necessarily lawful and permissible for us. I mean, that speaks that's like tailor-made for Orthodox Jews, that statement. And he makes reference to Orthodox Judaism as a form of difference as well in the speech. So did you went to public, some of you guys went to public school?
I think a couple of us went to private Catholic school briefly, but all of us none of us went only to Catholic school, and the second half of the family went almost, I think, entirely to public schools.
And yet it was sort of made clear to you, I asked you this before, you guys are all Catholic, like your parents, pretty traditional Catholics.
Yeah.
One of your brothers is a priest.
He's pretty traditional too.
Yeah, he's okay.
And as I was telling, we didn't all take the straight road, but for now we're all practicing Catholics,
This was modeled to you at home. You always went to church
it was
every
modeled
week.
Dad led grace before meals every night.
So he always came home for dinner.
He was always home for dinner. That was really important to him, and sometimes it was a real pain in the butt because we'd have to wait longer for dinner than we wanted. But he was always home for dinner.
And would say grace at the opening.
And he would say grace, and now I appreciate it much more than I did as a kid. That's hard to do, and I think it's important though. We had dinner as a family. We started that with a prayer. He drove us to church every week.
And you all went? We
all went. Obviously when we were older, some of us drove separately, in part because we may have been terrified of Dad's driving. And even though we didn't go to, even if we didn't go to Catholic
school. You lived with suburban
school,
Washington, Virginia? Is that what?
Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
And even though we didn't go to Catholic school, we went to what Catholics call CCD, which is weekly Catholic teaching. So, and that was, again, that my parents didn't lecture us often about Catholicism, but it was just clear to us that that's who we were. We were a Catholic family, and that meant, as my dad said, that meant missing out on some things and having different standards than a lot of our friends.
There was one interesting passage in that speech, and I think in another speech, which was a sort of un-Jewish passage, but still very striking, where he said that he once asked, he describes a Catholic boarding school, or a Catholic boarding school, maybe, but what you're preparing the students for, maybe if you want to mention that.
Go ahead.
Okay, so he says, he asked the head of the school said that he was preparing the students very well, and so the head of the school was asked, "What are you preparing them for?" So he says, a puzzled look came over the old man's face, as though he was surprised by a question that had such an obvious answer. Why, he said, for death, meaning they're preparing them for death.
Yeah.
A very Catholic response. What does that mean, do you think? That's a very, no Jew would say that.
Right.
We would say we're preparing them for our death. That's, but not for their death. That's a different thing, right? So.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
You
had no idea what you were getting into when you signed up
good.
for this, right? Yeah.
Central to my father's idea of what education should be about was value formation, and for a Catholic, that meant preparing yourself to go to heaven. Yeah. And so that's what that teacher meant in that instance. But even apart from that, going to what that graduation speech my father delivered, many of his speeches to students were about the importance of forming character at school or outside of school. He liked to quote something his father told him. And remember, his father was a college professor, somebody who took education seriously. But he said to my dad, knowledge, the brain, like any muscle, can be bought at a price. The only thing that is not for sale is character. And so my father would say to many student groups and to teachers too, that you need to focus on developing character, developing virtue. And that coincides with, the way you began that dissent. Part of creating virtue was making sure that there was room for religion, and not just privately, but also in the public square.
Yeah.
That's not the same as establishing a state religion, but making sure that religion is there as a source of virtue, because for most people it was, and the founders knew that, even if they weren't religious themselves.
That brings me to the next point, which is one of the most interesting things in the book, which is your dad's hero among the founders. If you had asked me, I'm very interested in the founders. If you had asked me to pick who would Justice Scalia love among the founders, I would say either Madison, because he's really the father of the Constitution, or John Adams, because he was brilliant, conservative, and cantankerous.
But he's from New England. That would have been. My mom was from Boston, and liking Adams would have been too much of a concession to her.
But his favorite founder is Washington, who is, as he stresses in many speeches, the least brilliant of the founders. And that comes up in maybe 5 to 10 speeches.
He loved George Washington and quoted him often, and
quotes the letter to Newport, to the Jews of Newport often.
He loved the letter to the Hebrew congregation. And I was telling you before, I had a Jewish friend in graduate school. I introduced her to my dad, and almost immediately he started talking about that letter, which I hadn't heard of before, and she actually hadn't, because she wasn't Orthodox. So that was. But my father loved George Washington because even though he wasn't the smartest, the other founders looked up to him because he had the strongest character. He was the one who was able to relinquish power when any other person in his position would have tried to seize more. People looked up to Washington, even people much smarter than him, because he was a man of great character.
If I had had a chance to talk to your father about this, which I would have welcomed, I would have welcomed just to talk to your father about anything, but I think he would have really liked, I would have said to him that, George Washington not only visited the Hebrew congregation of Newport, but they say that he actually visited the synagogue itself, and that if he actually sat through a sermon there, then they could put a sign where he sat which said, "George Washington slept here." He would have liked that, I think.
Good.
Yeah. So your father makes very clear in his judicial decisions that the people with whom he disagrees, and a line that he has a lot is, he doesn't attack people, he attacks ideas. There are some very good people with some very bad ideas. And the case that he makes there, if you follow the logic of originalism, which you described through pretty carefully, is that what's happening is actually not just that judges are wrong in interpreting a law, but they are usurping democracy, which is a pretty strong charge, I think correct, but a pretty strong charge. So it's a subversion of basically the founder's project itself. And yet, he's very good friends with some of the people that he's describing in the decisions as subverting democracy. There is a beautiful introduction to the book. And on the audio version, she reads the introduction by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think she and your father were really good friends. They clearly had there's that picture of them on the elephant. That's an actual picture of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia. Where are they in that?
They're in India there. I don't remember what the occasion was. But
They're just riding it. I mean,
they
I don't think they just went to India for the heck of it.
That's right.
Let's take off today, Ruth, and go to India and ride an elephant. But this is the same woman that he'll totally destroy in a dissent.
And she would attempt to destroy him too. It was mutual.
Not as well, but it's leaving aside that personality-wise, they're so different. I mean, there is an actual legal scholar who counted the times laughter appears in Supreme Court transcripts. You're familiar with this project. And it has been scientifically proven that not only was Justice Scalia the funniest justice, but he was 19 times funnier than Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
I wrote a lot of his material.
Yeah, obviously. So maybe tell us about this friendship and what we're supposed to draw from. And in the book, he has a speech about Ruth. She has a testament to him at the beginning. There is a roast of Justice Ginsburg in the book that Justice Scalia delivers, which is not very mean. I was kind of excited when I saw it, but he clearly loves her. Yeah. So maybe speak about what we're supposed to learn from that.
They became close friends in the early 80s when they were on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals together. And part of it was they liked each other's, working habits. They both liked argument. They liked engaging with each other and other people on the court. And not all judges like that. And in her foreword, Justice Ginsburg explains that some judges just want to write their opinions and be done with it. But judges like my dad and Justice Ginsburg want to go back and forth. They want their opinions to be improved by the people who disagree with them. So they would write notes to each other. They would visit each other's chambers and give each other insights into how these opinions with which they disagree could be improved, how they can be sharpened.
She did not go hunting with him, though.
No, but Elena Kagan did.
That's unbelievable to me. He took Elena Kagan hunting?
Yeah.
I don't see that. Yeah.
It's true. I think that there are pictures somewhere.
That's unbelievable.
The roast you mentioned is great. He delivered in the early 90s when she was still on the Court of Appeals and he was on the Supreme Court. So they weren't colleagues anymore, and he didn't know that they would be colleagues eventually again. So he makes fun of her a little bit, but the end of that speech is just a very moving statement about how much he misses her as a colleague and what a great friend she is. And it wasn't just they who got along. Their spouses were good friends too. Marty Ginsburg, the justice's husband, was a very good friend of my mother and my father, and a very good cook. So a very good friend of my father, now that I think of it. And my mom was also loved to cook, and so I think there was kind of this very close four-way friendship they had.
And they all loved opera or music.
Yeah, that's right. I should have started with that one. Yeah. They all loved opera, and Justice Ginsburg and my dad had a cameo in an opera, or a couple of operas. And I think it helped also that she grew up in New York City around the same time. I think that they had that to bond over too. So
there's an incredible, very interesting, and interesting Jewishly as well, a speech that your dad gave called On Dissents. Mm-hmm. And it was all about why it's important, the art of writing a dissent. He talks about some of the great dissents that have lived in the test of time. Mm-hmm. The single dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson against segregation, the dissent in Korematsu by Justice Jackson, I think, about the camps for Japanese. And of course, it's very personal to him because he has some very spirited, I guess we could put it, dissents. It's very clear, as I mentioned when he writes the dissents, that he's very dismissive in a sophisticated way of the other side. I'm just read one of my favorite dissents, which was in a case involving golf. There was a man who demanded the right due to a physical difficulty he had, that in competing in the golf tournament, he had to ride a golf cart in between the holes. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, part of golf is walking between hole and hole. And he sued under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he won. And your dad makes very clear that this is not an issue that should be decided by the Supreme Court, that he feels, in contrast to his colleagues. And so he says, he writes the following, and this is my favorite dissents. This was big on Cult of Scalia, this one. He says, we justices must, now he's writing with dripping with sarcasm, we justices must confront what is indeed an awesome responsibility. It has been rendered the solemn duty of the Supreme Court of the United States, laid upon it by Congress in pursuant of the federal government's power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, to decide what is golf. And he capitalizes the words, what is golf. I am sure that the framers of the Constitution, aware of the 1457 edict of King James II of Scotland, prohibiting golf because it interfered with the practice of archery, fully expected that sooner or later the paths of golf and government, the law and the links, would once again cross, and that the judges of this august court would someday have to wrestle with that age-old jurisprudential question for which their years of study in the law have so well prepared them. Is someone riding around the golf course from shot to shot really a golfer? The answer, we learn, is yes. The court ultimately concludes, and it shall henceforth be the law of the land that walking is not a fundamental aspect of golf. Now, this is hilarious, right? And made great fun for us. And by the way, because I know you mentioned this, when your dad, for Cult of Scalia people, when he quoted Officer Krupke from West Side Story in one of his dissents, that was huge for us as well. But one of the critiques that is put forward about your dad is that, well, maybe if he hadn't been so brutal, I mean that in a good way, but to a Justice Kennedy or to a Justice Souter, maybe they would have joined him the next time. And part of a Supreme Court decision is getting your dad used to say, 5 votes, you need 5 votes, right? He would say that sometimes in interviews. Curious what you think about that. And
Well, keep in mind that when they're writing when he would be writing the dissents, they'd already know the outcome. Right. So it's rare that a dissent is going to move anybody one way or another. So when my father wrote dissents, he used to say, or opinions in general, he used to say that he was writing for law students. He wasn't writing for the justices anymore. He was writing for people studying the law and the layman. And I think that comes through.
And a 16-year-old student in Yeshiva University.
Exactly.
Who might be reading seriously.
Right. So, passages like that convey his way of thinking, his jurisprudence very clearly and very memorably, and very humorously. For that reason, I mean, that it's perfect for the audience he was going for. And if you're right, I mean that's a pretty common argument, but I think it kind of shows. It misleads people about exactly how they go about the process. The minds are already made up, and the chances of an opinion like that hurting a justice's feelings so much that a justice decides to go against my dad just because he hurt my feelings last time.
Right.
So I don't think this is how the law reads. Right. They're professionals. They're not going to do that.
Well said. Before we close out, I want to talk about an incredible speech that I recommend to all of you, a very moving speech that your father gives to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I don't know. It's interesting that they even thought to invite him for the speech.
It's actually it was I think a congressional Holocaust remembrance thing in the Capitol. But still, I agree. Yeah, it was.
So I thought maybe we would share. I don't know if you want to read it or would you like me to read it, but just share this passage with the audience, just because it's so incredible. He writes as follows. He says, "I was profoundly honored." This is like an addition, by the way. If I do this well, I can do Scalia Speaks 2, the audible version, okay? As read by Meir Soloveichik. But this is really incredible. He says, "I was profoundly honored to have been invited to speak at this annual ceremony in remembrance of those consumed in the Holocaust. But it is not, I must tell you, an easy assignment for a non-Jew to undertake. I am an outsider speaking to an ancient people about a tragedy of unimaginable proportions that is intensely personal to them. I have no memories of parents or children, uncles or cousins caught up in and destroyed by the horror. I have not even that distinctive appreciation of evil that must come from knowing that 6 million people were killed for no other reason than that they had blood like mine running through their veins." And then he adds, "More difficult still, I am not only not a Jew, but I am a Christian, and I know that the anti-Semitism of many of my uncomprehending co-religionists over many centuries helped set the stage for the mad tragedy that the National Socialists produce." And then he describes going to Dachau and to Auschwitz, that he was there as a student and later in life. And then he adds the following. And this I think really speaks to one of the themes throughout the book. "The one message I want to convey today is that you will have missed the most frightening aspect of it all if you do not appreciate that it happened in one of the most educated, most progressive, most cultured countries in the world." And that, I think, speaks to really what your dad's legacy is all about, that brilliance is not enough to sustain, that brilliance has to be founded on character. Yeah. That's why you need the George Washington before you get to the John Adams and the Madison. And is that right? I mean, I think.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And he goes on to explain that that we need to remember that backsliding is always possible, and that scientific progress and cultural developments can fool us into believing that moral progression is also inevitable. But the Holocaust should remind us that that's absolutely not the case. And so we need to teach our children and each other that there are certain uncompromisable values, no matter how progressive we are or advanced we are in other ways.
It really is an incredible book, and a real tribute to your father. I want to close with a quote, and then we have a brief 1-minute clip that we'd like to show all of you about another project in which the Straus Center is engaged. But before we do that, I just, in thanking you, not just for this evening, but for all the love and effort that you put into making this book happen, I wanted to quote what your dad says about his hero, George Washington. So I'm quoting this about a hero of mine, applying it to Justice Scalia's life. But he gave this at Mount Vernon, which I loved reading because my wife and I took our kids to Mount Vernon on July 4th, actually. And it was really incredible. But he spoke there about his love of Washington, not just as an American, but as a Virginian. And he says, throughout his many adventures, George Washington never lost his love for Mount Vernon, and it was to here that he always returned when his work allowed. He is buried here in the family tomb, along with Martha. His final words, a characteristically pithy and yet accurate summation of his life, was, quote, "'Tis well." And I think that's a very good summation of your father's life as well. "'Tis well, 'tis well, 'tis well." And we want to thank you in that spirit for the extraordinary work that you have done in sharing your father's legacy.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Before we close, ladies and gentlemen, before you leave, just wanted to share one brief clip with you, and this will set up the dessert, and outside there will be some coffee and cake. Over the past summer, on behalf of the Tikva Fund, who is partnered with the Straus Center in a variety of ways, through the generosity of Roger Hertog, has been very generous to the Straus Center. We recorded for Tikva. I delivered a series of lectures on Judaism and the American idea, and now our own project on early America and the Jews at the Straus Center, which has been started through the generosity of the Capito family, will be partnering with the Tikva Fund in making these videos available. And so you'll be able to sign up for a small fee to watch these lectures online. If you sign up outside now at the dessert, you will also receive a copy of Scalia Speaks. And so that's a bargain, which is something that I think this Jewish crowd would like, and something that this Jewish crowd liking.
That's very offensive.
Yeah, exactly. That Justice Scalia, I think, would have very much appreciated. So there are members of our partners from the Tikva Fund, young people out at the front with both iPads if you want to learn more about this course, as well as they have the books there with them. And I'm sure that Christopher, if you nudge him, would be very happy to sign the book for you. We have a 1-minute clip from the Tikva Fund showing you a few clips of these lectures. Jews here had never had it so good. Here you have someone who's a friend of the Founding Fathers. He's wealthy, he's accepted, he's embraced. The only thing he can't do is serve in the legislature while retaining his fealty to Judaism. So what?
Paine advances this argument in the name of the Hebrew Bible. Why does an old infidel like Thomas Paine do that?
Now that they had engaged in this great revolution, what should be the symbol of their cause and of this new nation?
We're going to go to a wedding. Tell us about it.
And in fact, as we shall see, he became the first advocate for religious liberty in this new nation. He is the most important American Jew that many of you have never heard of. Your miraculous story is paralleled in our miraculous story. Imagine receiving a letter like that from the head of a new nation. There is a Jewish grave on the estate of the third president of the United States. We know very little about the woman who was buried there, but we know a great deal about her father, Jonas Phillips, and about her son, Commodore Uriah Phillips Levy. And we will be using the saga of the Phillips family as a lens by which to see both the extraordinary and unique nature of the Jewish experience in America, as well as the impact of Jewish ideas on America's founding. Thank you all. Please join me in thanking Christopher Scalia again.